Never get this episode wet, and definitely don't feed it after midnight. It's Game Boy Works episode 127.
I'm giving you whatever grade you think you deserve.
Then I'll take an A.
This week we have another game based on a movie that begins with the letter G. Gremlins 2 is no Godzilla, but it's still pretty respectable.
If nothing else, how nice is it to finally have a solid little 8-bit side-scrolling platform action game on Game Boy again? I think the last one of these we saw may well have been Sunsoft's previous movie-based release, Batman the Video Game. Gremlins 2 isn't exactly identical to that one, but it's not too far off, especially in general terms. It's a Sunsoft 8-bit licensed game, which means you know going in it'll have a few things working in its favor. One, it's going to look and sound as good as you could possibly hope on its respective hardware. Two, it's going to play well with responsive controls and rock-solid programming. Three, it's going to be remorselessly difficult. And four, it's probably not going to revolutionize the medium in any real sense. Gremlins 2 lives up to all of these expectations. It has more or less nothing to do with the more famous NES game by the same title, which took the form of a sort of top-down shooter platformer that seems to have been built around the overhead sequences and Blaster Master in its spiritual follow-up, FESTER'S Quest. Instead, what we have here is an old-school run-and-jump platformer, basically the default mode of 8-bit license games. Gremlins 2 is in no way an earth-shattering creation, though it could end up being screen-shattering thanks to its aggressive difficulty level. I have to imagine that more than one kid or adult expressed their anger management issues by chucking their Game Boy at a wall after one too many frustrating unfair deaths. This is the one significant flaw in Gremlins 2, aside from perhaps its hilarious brevity. You, taking the role of the adorable Mogwai Gizmo, have no real physical strength to speak of. You begin the game unarmed and defenseless. Once you do pick up your basic weapon, that weapon is a crappy little wooden pencil that takes multiple attacks to kill an enemy. That in itself might not be so terrible if not for the fact that the pencil has horrible range. Gizmo is no Simon Belmont, that's for sure. The combination of having a few pixels of attack of range beyond Gizmo's own vulnerable hitbox and needing to strike enemies multiple times adds up to a generally poor experience. Combat consists of getting right up in enemies' faces, hitting them, fading back immediately so they don't walk into you while they're immune to a second attack yet still capable of moving around, attacking again once their invincibility wears off, and repeating as many times as necessary. That's fine when you're dealing with slow-moving enemies on flat ground, but you don't encounter a lot of those, especially beyond the first stage. Gremlins 2 likes to make you fight bats that hover erratically over pits of springs and spikes, which forces you to jump carefully and line up an attack in midair. On top of that, most of the enemies consist of gremlins, which of course makes perfect sense in terms of the movie, where endless waves of gremlins run amok in a New York City skyscraper, but you really get to the point where you dread the sight of them here. Gremlins take 3 hits to take down at a minimum, and most of them have some sort of attack ability that makes it impossible to simply walk up to them, pop them on the kisser with your number 2 Kohinoor, and duck back to safety. You have your lady gremlins, skateboarding gremlins who zip around at high speeds and jump unpredictably, gremlin heads that pop up and obstruct your path. The game likes to stick these guys in narrow spaces at the far end of a conveyor belt moving in the opposite direction, where you more or less have to soak up a hit or two in order to get close enough to attack. There are also gremlins who stay safely out of Gizmo's reach and fire off projectiles or unleash rolling objects that you need to avoid carefully. Even the basic-ass walking gremlins tend to appear in conjunction with conveyor belts or near pits and springs that force you to carefully regulate your movements. This game stacks itself against you from the outset, and it only gets worse the further you advance. Gizmo does have a few options available for beefing up his arsenal from time to time. You can pick up a portable stereo, a boom box in the vernacular of the day, which allows you to launch a single, high-powered, ranged attack at enemies. You can also hide yourself in a box that instantly murders just about any enemy it touches. I say just about because a handful of enemies are indestructible and will cause the box to disappear if you make contact with them. Likewise, if a projectile or spike hits your box, it's gone. There are a lot of limitations like this on Gizmo's fleeting upgrades, in fact. You can forget about carrying anything besides your puny pencil into boss battles, for example, because they're stripped away as soon as you cross the boss threshold. Still, despite their limitations, the temp upgrades do make a big difference in terms of Gizmo's survivability. Every little bit helps in a game so relentlessly pitched against your success. There's one particularly horrible sequence in the 4th stage where you have to navigate a series of conveyor belts and spikes while effectively blind. Your actions are obscured by panels in the foreground, basically forcing you to maneuver based on the feel of your movements in order to climb a series of deadly platforms. This would all be a lot to ask of players on even a more technically impressive platform than Game Boy. But bear in mind, Sunsoft released this game in December 1990, before Super Game Boy existed, before Game Boy Pocket, before Game Boy Light. Anyone playing Gremlins 2 at the time of its release was playing on a blurry screen with poor visibility, low contrast, and a fair amount of lag. That's a lot to ask us to deal with. But I suppose that was the Sunsoft way. Technically excellent, rock-solid aesthetics, punishingly hateful design. Still, my biggest complaint about Gremlins 2 for Game Boy isn't the fact that it's preposterously difficult to the point of being wildly inappropriate for its platform and target demographic. For better or for worse, that was just how games were back then, and at least this one demonstrates so much genuine technical excellence. No, the real problem is that it really falls short of the sheer weirdness of the film. Gremlins 2 is only barely a movie in the sense of a traditional narrative. It begins and ends with fairly normal framing sequences, but the middle chunk of the movie basically just consists of puppet anarchy. Gizmo navigates his way through a skyscraper full of gremlins who seem more concerned with goofing than with murderous intent, which really feels more on brand for creatures called gremlins than the suburban death machines depicted in the first film. Director Joe Dante and his crew clearly had a great time putting together Gremlins 2, although I'm sure their reliance on practical puppet effects caused no end of sleepless nights for the effects crew. And the movie famously strains against its own medium. One original plan for the story involved having real paid actors running through the theater when the film projector has its supposed breakdown during screenings. In any case, this was about as close to duck-amuck as we're ever likely to see from a major Hollywood production. But this is just a standard platform action game. I mean, it's a very well-crafted platform action game, even if it hates your happiness, but still there's none of that playful chaos here, the gleeful dismantling of what it means to be a summer blockbuster. You're just a little guy who runs and jumps across platforms and conveyor belts, hitting enemies that bear some visual resemblance to characters in the movie. But they don't really do anything beyond display some simple behaviors, and you certainly don't challenge the paradigm of how video games should work, unless you consider a crushingly difficult platform sequence that you need to navigate through guesswork a stirring rebellion against game design rubric. Personally, I'm not convinced. But then again, I'm not an 8-year-old asking his parents for Game Boy games based on his favorite movies in 1990, so I doubt Sunsoft cares much what I have to say about Gremlins 2.
Oh, good. Another baseball game. Yay.
Yes, I'm afraid that there's just no escaping the threat of baseball games when it comes to talking about 8-bit consoles from Japan. Honestly, it's a major miracle that we got away with just one when it came to SG-1000. Pocket Stadium, which sadly is missing the word monster in the middle of its name to make it an infinitely more appealing game, comes to us from Atlus. Those keeping count at home will note that Pocket Stadium was Atlus's second ever baseball creation, the first having been Major League Baseball for NES. Despite the Famicom audience's insatiable thirst for baseball, Major League Baseball never actually shipped in Japan. Atlus developed it, or maybe farmed it out to an anonymous subcontractor, for LJN exclusively for the US. But that's okay because Pocket Stadium makes up for it by shipping exclusively in Japan. I think. Researching this game proved more difficult than I had expected because around 10 years after its debut, Nintendo released a wildly popular game that would make an absolute hash of online search results for Pocket Stadium. That is, Pocket Monster Stadium.
There it goes!
It does appear as though Atlus at least floated the idea of bringing Pocket Stadium to the US, since it was previewed by Game Players magazine. Curiously, that mini article describes it as having been created by Asuka Technologies. You may recall Asuka from the Cosmo Tank episode some time back. Cosmo Tank is the only game ever published with an in-game credit for Asuka Technologies. At the time I put together that episode, the only online mentions of Asuka speculated that it was a developer or subcontractor for Atlus. At this point, a clearer picture has emerged. Based on several sources, including Giant Bomb, Asuka Technologies began as an overseas marketing subsidiary for a very young Atlus, but that subsidiary quickly became Atlus USA. So, mystery solved, and we can speculate with some confidence that Atlus and Asuka explored releasing Pocket Stadium for America. I think you only need to spend a few minutes with Pocket Stadium to understand why they didn't. Now, I'm not an expert in 8-bit baseball games by any means. Whenever the topic appears in Crontendo, I enter a fugue state for a few minutes until a bad platformer or inscrutable Dragon Quest clone appears. But still, I can't say I've ever encountered another 8-bit baseball game quite like Pocket Stadium. It's not so much a baseball game as a baseball simulator, which is a fine but essential distinction. Standard baseball games play out as tests of reaction and timing, even the bad ones. Pocket Stadium, on the other hand, works as more of a test of prediction, and if you want to be generous, a bit of strategic planning. What sets Pocket Stadium apart from its peers is its batting interface. It looks normal enough at first glance, almost exactly like a monochrome version of MLB for NES, with stubby little guys stepping up to the plate for a duel. But rather than wait for the duel to begin and take a swing at the pitcher's best shot, Pocket Stadium instead asks you to guess what the pitcher's best shot is going to be. Before the pitch makes its way to the plate, you, the batter, have to choose how you're going to swing the bat. A 3x3 strike zone grid appears before you, along with a menu of swing options. Well, technically it's a 5x5 grid, but the outer boxes represent spaces outside the strike zone, so it's the 9 squares in the middle that you really focus on. You can bunt, you can choose not to swing, or you can just go for it, one of several different ways, with different kinds of swings targeting different clusters of grid squares. Your menu options allow you to get extremely specific and focus on a single square, or take a broader swing that covers as many as 6 or even 9 squares depending on the batter. From what I can tell, the more granular your choice, the more effective your hit. But obviously, the less likely you are to actually make contact with the ball. On the other hand, if you spam the big 6 or 9 square options, you'll hit pretty often, but the ball will more likely fly foul, or worse, pop up and land in some infielder's mitt. Much of the rest of the game works more or less automatically. You don't even have any control over fielding. The pitching interface works about the same as batting, which is to say, both the batter and pitcher basically try to outguess each other. This is of course every bit as awful as any other 8-bit sports game for single-player mode. The CPU knows every choice you make, and kind of arbitrarily decides whether to let you have a win or not. I mean, this game already feels like an exercise in guesswork, but when moment-to-moment action comes down to whether or not the computer decides to let you win, you may as well play the lottery. I can see this being a lot more interesting for 2 people, though. In fact, the concept of selecting actions in advance isn't too different from the way many football games, such as Madden NFL. When both players essentially make blind selections, it becomes more of a psychological battle, a test of wits. Maybe that's being too generous, but it's got to be more interesting than making blind selections against a CPU opponent and hoping the RNG decides to grace you with a smile. As baseball games go, I suppose this isn't a bad way to take advantage of the Game Boy's linked together nature with individual screens by asking players to outguess and outwit their real-life opponent with secret commands. You know, sort of like Pokemon, although I'd take Pocket Monster Stadium over Pocket Stadium any day.
Next time on Game Boy Works, get ready for an absolute unit.